Let us continue with Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, and today we are going to have a look at the next stanza, that is the fourth stanza of the poem. First, I should recite the fourth stanza. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou. O uncontrollable, if even I were as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy skied speed scarce seemed a vision, I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. O lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. The key idea here in this stanza is the poet himself, the poet's weakness, as well as the poet's desire to free the mankind from all kinds of constraints and constrictions. And that is why he makes a prayer, makes a plea, makes an appeal to the west wind. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. This stanza is a prayer to the west wind, in fact. It is autobiographical in tone, where the poet compares himself with the west wind and invokes its help in the hour of need. The poet's appeal to the west wind sounds like a prayer or confession. This confession does not address God, because let me remind you that at one stage in his life, Shelley was also an atheist. This confession does not address God and therefore sounds very impersonal. Whereas the previous stanzas were clearly directed to the west wind, there is a change here as the focus is shifted from the wind to the speaker, who says, if I were a dead leaf, and makes it very clear that what the poet talks about now is himself. The frequency of the first person pronoun I several times, and then besides I, my and me also in the stanza shows it very clearly that the poem so far appeared very anonymous and was only concentrated on the wind and its force. But now the personality of the author becomes the subject of this stanza, which finally vanishes towards the end of the poem. The poet here in this stanza reverts to the images of the preceding stanzas, and the first stanza, the second stanza, the third stanza, and applies them to himself, thus providing a skillful transition from the natural phenomena he has depicted to his own plight, because he feels that he stands badly in need of energy and strength. Having described the power of the west wind on the natural phenomena, the poet now turns to his own self. He dramatizes the atmosphere and recalls the situations of the first three stanzas by using the same picture of the leaf, cloud, and wave in consonance with the wind, in connection with the wind, and they now exist with the author. They now exist in connection with the author. Shelley identifies himself with the wind and wishes, if I were a dead leaf, a swift cloud, or a wave, although he knows that he cannot do that, so that he too could experience the distinctive and creative power of the wind, and thus share the impulse of its vigor and strength. He deplores the passing away of his boyhood, when the thought of outstripping the wind never seemed impossible to him. That Shelley is intensely aware of his constraints in life is clear. Constraints means limitations or constrictions in life. It is clear as he pleads with the wind and says, "Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud." The poet was once, like the west wind, fiery, free, and uncontrollable in his youthful days. He was opposed to the conventions and defied authority. He was proud to preach the ideals of liberty and freedom in the world. Here, Shelley strikes a deeply personal note also, which is ultimately lost in the more passionate cry for the regeneration of mankind. Fully conscious of his own limitations, the poet now prays to the west wind to lift him as a wave, a leaf, a cloud, as he falls upon the thorns of life and pleads. The wind would carry him on its wings like the seeds in the first stanza. The seeds, if you remember, are swayed or swept by the force of the west wind, and they are buried underground for germination or renewal of life. Regermination, renewal of new life, which signifies rebirth or regeneration. He wishes to participate in the mighty movement of the wind, but it remains uncontrollable because it cannot be overpowered by human beings. The poet also thinks of the clouds that are flown away by the wind. He also thinks of the waves in the third stanza, where the waves of the sea are agitated or influenced by the force of the west wind. The poet desires to enjoy the experiences of the waves when the west wind blows over them. Shelley longs for or thirsts to be affected by the sway of the west wind. The poet feels himself to be inferior in freedom to none but the west wind. In his boyhood days, the poet was free and uncontrollable, as I have already pointed out, like the wind, uncontrollable like the wind, and could be a competitor of the west wind in its speed. The sky is speed. There is a phrase in the text. As I recited the poem, if you have noticed, there was sky. The sky is a noun, and the noun has been here transferred the job of the work of the function of a verb, where it signifies that the wind blows across the sky as fast as it could, piercing through the whole of the sky, covering the whole of the sky. So, once again I repeat, but with the passage of time he feels quite miserable and helpless, and in a state of great distress. He is wounded by troubles and tribulations of life, and his spirit is curbed by the deadly load of life and its misfortunes and miseries. And why he feels helpless? Because now the west wind is too fast to be competed with. It is uncontrollable, and that is why he cannot be a competitor to the west wind. He cannot beat the west wind in competition, in its speed. And that is why this deadly load of life and its misfortunes and miseries has burdened him. The poet feels restrained or chained by a heavy weight of hours or time, because with the passage of time he has lost his energy. He feels less energetic. Hours of time, and he is left to brood over his pains, his sorrows, his miseries. He has grown in years, and his aim and ambitions have all been thwarted or defeated. His ardor and zeal has been chilled by the trials and sufferings of life. He would never have felt so helpless or belittled before the west wind as it is the case now. The roses of life have faded now, leaving the thorns for the poet. Shelley also implores the west wind to lift him above the sorrows and miseries of worldly life, just as it has lifted the waves, the leaves, or the clouds with its might, or with its power, or with its force or energy. Indeed, he still retains the fiery spirit of his boyhood, but lacks the physical energy of those days. Otherwise, he would not have prayed so passionately, so earnestly to the west wind, meditating over and recollecting his childhood days. He says that he might have run with the wind and raced with the cloud at a speed, at a skied speed, with which the west wind blows across the sky. In his childhood, to outrun the wind scarcely seemed impossible or an impossibility. For a moment, Shelley dwells upon the days of his boyhood or childhood or adult days, when he could be the comrade of thy wind's wanderings over the heaven. He was then able to participate in the mighty power of the nature's spirit, which is west wind here. Not able to participate in it now is to be alienated from the very essence of life. Shelley believes that nature is as much alive as a human being is and has a soul too. Everything on this earth is directed by his soul or this soul. The poet says directly that once he too was like the soul symbolized by the west wind. Tameless. Tameless signifies freedom, unlimited energy which he enjoyed to compete with the wind as the wind blows across the sky. So wind which is tameless and swift and proud. Why proud? Because energetic. However, at the present moment, he feels that he has been chained or bowed by a heavy weight of hours. If we can recall earlier also, I had mentioned that Shelley believed in Rousseau's dictum that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Now, those chains to which Rousseau has referred to or talked about have been here brought in by Shelley in this stanza when he says that he feels chained and bowed by heavy weight of hours. The line, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, has been seen as a key to the thought that the present miserable condition of the poet is never sentimental or self-pitying. He is not self-pitying himself. The poet has understood that he cannot compete with the wind anymore, although he was once like the wind, tameless and swift and proud, because he remains chained to the earth by sorrows and miseries. The expression, a heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed, may be a reference to the years that have imprisoned human lives with miseries, and indicates how people with hope fought for freedom from all kinds of exertions in life. And that is why the slogan of the French Revolution, liberty, equality and fraternity, was the one that inspired the Romantic poets also. With this, I conclude my discussions for this stanza, and the same spirit continues in the next stanza, where Shelley expresses his wish or desire to spread this thought for regeneration, his thoughts or his ideas for regeneration or rebirth of mankind from mankind that is suffering from miseries or that is chained by the sufferings or miseries or pains of this worldly life. So thank you. That's all for today. We shall continue next time. Thanks.